I've always believed that Oxford keeps its truest memories tucked beneath its pavements, as if the stones themselves are reluctant archivists of our quieter failings. Even now, thinking back to that particular evening, I can almost hear the soft drag of my footsteps beneath the lantern arch, stretched out in the mist like a half-forgotten refrain. Whether the echo belonged to me or to someone I had once been foolish enough to trust, I still cannot say with confidence. Memory lends itself too easily to invention, especially when dusk is involved. I had walked without purpose that night, threading myself through the familiar quadrangles in the faint hope that the cold might steady my thoughts. There are times when one does not require answers so much as an interlude, and Oxford, with its worn cloisters and occasional flare of lantern light, has always offered me that small mercy. I paused beneath the arch when the bells of Merton began their indecisive tolling, neither joyous nor solemn, but something trembling between the two. It was then I felt the faint echo shift, as if a second set of steps hesitated a moment after mine. I turned, of course, and found nothing. The following morning brought no clarity. Only a note slid under my door in Strange's unmistakable hand, accompanied by a clipped cutting from the Oxford Mail. Strange had added no commentary, which was wise of him. He understood the futility of offering me interpretations before I had asked for them. The printed headline declared the unfortunate death of Dr. Adrian Loxwood, a lecturer of medieval poetry at St. Gervais College, whose name I'd encountered in passing footnotes more often than in person. The article insisted upon an accidental fall from a stairwell, though the phrase "no suspicion of foul play" clung to the page with a defensiveness I found vaguely offensive. Lewis arrived an hour later, bearing coffee and his usual optimism. He observed that accidents happen, especially to men who spend most of their time reading texts written before the invention of indoor plumbing. I reminded him that scholarly absent-mindedness rarely results in perfectly timed deaths, though I admitted I had nothing but unease to support that observation. He suggested gently that I might be projecting his word, not some recent disappointment, onto an innocent tragedy. I let the remark settle without rebuttal. Lewis is often right, and the truth does not suffer from my silence. Still, something small and insistent had already begun to tap at the back of my mind a line from a crossword puzzle I had attempted the previous night, though not successfully. Hidden descent, born of misplaced pride. 5 letters. I hadn't solved it, but its tone nestled too neatly against the newspaper's brittle certainty for my comfort. These coincidences rarely prove themselves meaningful, but one becomes wary of ignoring them altogether. By late afternoon, I found myself returning to the lantern arch, though I hadn't intended to revisit it. Oxford has a way of shepherding one toward unfinished thoughts. The air was colder than the previous night, the light thinner. The archway stood precisely as it always had, quiet, indifferent, holding its history with maddening discretion. Yet as I stood there, I again felt the faint impression, like the aftertaste of a sound rather than the sound itself. A soft hesitation in the air behind me, no louder than a breath held too long. When I finally made my way towards St. Gervais College, the decision felt less like a choice than an obligation. I claimed it was to gather information more thoroughly, though in truth I suspected the case, if indeed there was a case at all, had already begun its slow, inevitable pull. There are investigations one enters willingly, and others that admit you quietly, as if you were always meant to arrive. Loxwood's death, accidental or otherwise, belonged to the latter category. I crossed the threshold of the college just as the first drops of rain darkened the stone. The porter looked up with a flicker of recognition, though whether he recognized my face or merely the type of man who arrives after a death, I couldn't be certain. I asked to be shown the stairwell. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Somewhere behind me, I thought I heard footsteps again, soft, delayed, almost careful. But when I turned, as the porter unlocked the door, The corridor lay empty, holding its secrets with familiar patience. I remember the way the air shifted inside St. Gervais College that afternoon, thin, expectant, as if the old building had decided to draw in a breath and hold it until I left. Some colleges wear their age with indulgent ease, but St. Gervais has always struck me as a place that resented mortality, preferring its history untainted by the clumsiness of human endings. Even walking across the quad felt like trespass. Lewis kept a step behind me, his tread reassuringly steady. He remarked, with his usual blend of politeness and unease, that the master sounded relieved when we telephoned. I had sensed the same thing, a faint tremor of gratitude in Sir Quentin Warrener's voice, as though our arrival might have tidied up something inconvenient. Relief is rarely the first emotion of an innocent man, though I refrained from saying so aloud. Sir Quentin greeted us in his study with the polished warmth of a man accustomed to managing fragile egos. He insisted Lockswood's death was a tragedy of the gentlest sort, a man overtaken by misfortune. Yet his eyes flicked almost involuntarily toward a stack of correspondence on the corner of his desk. Lewis asked whether the matter had caused disruption among the fellows. The master murmured something about the delicacy of the academic temperament. I found myself more interested in the silence that followed his words than in the words themselves. We proceeded to Lockswood's rooms. The corridor floorboards groaned beneath us, protesting the intrusion. A faint odor of dust and old vellum lingered long before we reached the door. When Sir Quentin unlocked it, a thin gust of stale air drifted past, carrying with it the unmistakable perfume of solitude, that mixture of ink, forgotten books, and an unwashed teacup that seems to grow only in the rooms of men who prefer the company of footnotes to faces. Lockswood's study was cluttered but not chaotic. Marginal notes scribbled with impatient intensity. Manuscripts half-translated. A stack of postcards depicting ruined abbeys. Lewis commented softly that the place seemed peaceful. I thought otherwise. There was a tension in the room, the kind that accumulates when a mind reaches for something it cannot quite grasp. On the desk, pinned above the blotter, I found a line from Pearl misquoted by a single deliberate word. It was the sort of alteration no competent medievalist would make by accident. A locked drawer drew my attention. Sir Quentin shifted uncomfortably, insisting that anything within would relate only to private research. He did not forbid me from opening it. He merely hoped I would not. I let my fingers rest briefly upon the metal handle before deciding that haste rarely rewards the curious. There would be time. 3 names surfaced as naturally as breath: Helena Swithin, Julian Harbury, and Vera Malling. Each had reason to orbit Lockswood's life, though not necessarily his death. Helena, the philologist with a mind sharper than her tone. She had written a celebrated article on medieval grief, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether scholarship is sometimes only a way to avoid speaking plainly about one's own losses. Harbury, younger, handsome in a forgettable way, and far too ready with compliments that felt practiced rather than earned. He spoke of Lockswood as though reading from a prepared eulogy, each phrase polished to a quiet shine. Yet his gaze kept drifting toward the stairwell window, as though checking whether the scene outside remained unchanged. And Malling, the bursar, who seemed made of angles rather than curves. Her eyes flickered with the restless arithmetic of someone accustomed to balancing too many accounts, both financial and personal. She said little, but the careful neutrality of her silence told me she had already edited the narrative for public consumption. As we stepped back into the corridor, Lewis remarked that they all seemed sincere. I answered only that sincerity is the cheapest currency in a place that worships its own cleverness. A faint rustle echoed from the far end of the passage, like a foot sliding against stone, but when we turned, the hallway lay empty. Still, something in Lockswood's rooms had stirred the beginnings of a pattern. a misquoted poem, a locked drawer left patiently waiting, and the wary glances of people who claimed to share nothing but scholarship. I felt then, as I often do, the first faint tug of meaning no more than a thread, yet enough to suggest the shape of something hidden just beyond the edge of certainty. The stairwell at St. Gervais was narrower than I remembered such places being, though memory has a habit of trimming away discomfort. Even in daylight, the passage felt reluctant to reveal itself, its walls steeped in the faded scent of damp and chalk dust. Lewis walked a few steps ahead, his torch pushing a thin white blade through the dimness. I followed more slowly, making note of the silence that seemed too absolute for such a central corner of the college. It felt curated like an alibi, rehearsed a little too well. Lewis remarked that the fall looked straightforward enough. The words floated back to me with the conscientious neutrality of a man trying not to predispose the investigation. I answered only with a hum, my eyes drawn to the scuff on the opposite wall. It sat higher than a stumbling hand might reach, yet not high enough to imply anything dramatic. A mark made by intention, or at least by a moment of resistance. Lockswood had not simply surrendered to gravity. Something or someone had interfered. A faint impression of grit beneath my fingertips suggested the scuff was recent. I recalled one of Lockswood's colleagues describing him as absent-minded, and I wondered, not for the first time, whether absent-minded men acquire these reputations because the alternative explanation would force others to acknowledge their own cruelty. We reached the landing where the porter claimed he had found the body. Lewis crouched to study the floor, noting that the stone was uneven. He observed that such irregularities could easily cause a misstep. I pointed instead to the faint crescent of dust displaced near the banister, as though someone had hovered there after the fall, debating whether to descend or flee. It was not conclusive, of course. Nothing worthwhile ever is at first glance. The porter awaited us at the base of the stairs, a stout, fretful presence whose eyes lingered too long on the banister. He recalled hearing footsteps near the lantern arch shortly after midnight, though he insisted they could have belonged to anyone. I asked why he had assumed it was Lockswood. His answer habit, routine, a vague sense of familiarity felt too pliant to accept. He glanced away as he spoke, toward the quad, where the early evening shadows had begun to stretch themselves thin across the stones. A folded scrap of paper poked from a gap in the stairwell's baseboard. I eased it free, noticing the faint tremor in Lewis's posture as he waited for me to announce some revelation. Instead, I found only a line of text written in a cramped but steady hand, where lantern light divides silence from truth. A phrase familiar enough to prickle the mind, yet frustratingly incomplete. Lewis suggested it might reference a tutorial or a poem Lockswood admired. I kept the possibility to myself that it might instead be the echo of a meeting arranged in hesitation rather than hope. St. Gervais had many corridors, each with its own character, yet this stairwell seemed particularly weighted with the kind of stillness that follows an unexpected tragedy. A gust of cold air spiraled up from the entrance as a student passed outside, and I felt the temperature drop by degrees, as though the college itself had exhaled something it would rather keep hidden. As we stepped back into the hallway, the walls appeared to lean inward almost imperceptibly. I caught myself looking toward the lantern arch through a narrow window. The distance was not far close enough for whispered words, for a confrontation that needed privacy, but not isolation. Close enough for another pair of footsteps to have merged, briefly, with Lockswood's final walk. Lewis asked whether I believed the death was accidental. I heard my own voice answer with a quiet uncertainty, though the truth was already gathering shape beneath my thoughts. If an accident, it was an accident arranged by the sort of reluctance that leaves scuff marks on stone and scraps of paper tucked where no one ought to find them. When we stepped outside, the sky had begun to bruise with the color of early dusk. The air smelled faintly of old paper and rain-soaked leaves. I remember thinking, in a moment that felt almost like intuition, that Lockswood's misstep had been less of a fall and more of a nudge subtle enough to escape the college's pride, but not subtle enough to escape mine. I've always believed that certain rooms hold their breath when grief enters them, as though unwilling to disturb whatever fragile shape sorrow takes. Helena Swithin's office was one such room, narrow, pale, and scented faintly of chalk rubbed into wood. The late afternoon light slid timidly across her desk, illuminating the small drifts of paper that seemed to have accumulated more through hesitation than disorder. She greeted us with an inclination rather than a smile, her voice the low register of someone who has grown accustomed to being misinterpreted and has resigned herself to it. Lewis introduced our purpose with the soft tact he reserves for women whose intelligence intimidates him. Helena listened, her hands folded with an almost ceremonial precision. When she finally spoke, it was with the measured cadence of a scholar who fears that an excess of sincerity might expose something she has concealed too carefully. She called Lockswood a friend, nothing more, and yet the faint dryness that clung to her next breath told me the word had cost her something. I asked whether she had corresponded with him recently. A peculiar stillness crossed her face, the kind that slips in when truth and pride brush against each other. She gestured toward a stack of papers, claiming she had been revising an article and had little time for personal letters. The gesture was smooth enough, but her fingers lingered on the top sheet a fraction too long, as though resisting the impulse to hide something beneath it. I let the silence draw out. Scholars dislike silence. It forces them to confront the things they cannot footnote. Eventually she rose and crossed to the bookshelf, selecting a volume with needless care. As she did, I noticed the faint trace of chalk on her sleeve, smudged in a way that suggested haste. A message erased from her board, perhaps something written, regretted, and wiped away. Lewis, ever loyal to the decorum of conversations, asked whether she knew of any tension between Harbury and Lockswood. Helena's posture tightened almost imperceptibly. She replied that academic disagreements were inevitable, though rarely fatal. A thin attempt at humor lived at the edge of her voice, but never quite matured into a smile. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the window, where the first threads of rain were beginning to trace delicate lines down the glass. It was then that I saw the letter. Half hidden beneath an annotated manuscript, its edges crumpled by repeated handling, lay an envelope addressed in Lockswood's neat hand. The seal had never been broken. I asked whether she intended to read it. Helena's throat tensed. She murmured that she had found it among her pigeonholes that very morning, though she had no idea why Lockswood would write to her after weeks of silence. Her explanation held the tone of someone rehearsing disbelief rather than feeling it. I considered the envelope more closely. The flap bore a faint indentation, the sort made when one hovers a moment before sealing something irrevocable. A confession, perhaps, or a request for clemency. I thought of the misquoted line from Pearl pinned above Lockswood's desk in alteration, subtle enough to be deliberate. A signal meant for someone who would notice it. Someone like Helena. She insisted she had not yet found the courage to open the letter. Her voice carried a brittle steadiness, the kind that forms only when one has spent too long pretending that truths do not matter. I asked whether she might allow us to take it for examination. She refused with a quiet finality that surprised even herself. The envelope, she said, belonged to a life she was not prepared to exhume. Lewis shifted beside me, sensing the conversation had become delicate. I let my gaze wander around the room, taking note of the carefully maintained order that did not quite mask an undertone of agitation. On the windowsill, a thin layer of chalk dust suggested something recently wiped clean. A phrase or a name, perhaps, erased before it had the chance to accuse. On our way out, Helena stopped me with a question that felt more like a plea wrapped in formality. She asked whether I believed Adrian had suffered. I told her quietly that I did not know. It was the closest thing to mercy I could offer. As we stepped back into the corridor, the creaking of the floorboards seemed unusually loud, as though carrying a message we had not yet learned to decipher. And in the dim hush that followed, I understood that the unfinished letter was less a relic of affection than a map of a wound one Helena had carried far longer than she cared to admit. It was the sort of evening Oxford reserves for those who have lately begun to doubt themselves mild, a little evasive, and indifferent to the heaviness of one's thoughts. I found myself in the senior common room of St. Gervais, where the air carried the faint perfume of old upholstery and a more recent trace of claret. Conversations drifted around me in low currents, each sentence polished by the speaker's desire to appear clever without the burden of sincerity. Academic rooms have a way of encouraging performance. Perhaps that is why truth hides so well within them. Julian Harbury arrived with the bright ease of a man who had rehearsed his expressions in the mirror. He offered condolences, then observations, then a light quip about medievalists and their tendency to slip on metaphors as easily as on stone stairs. None of it was malicious, only calculated. Lewis, with his instinctive kindness, fell briefly under the spell. I watched instead the small betrayals of Harbury's composure, the way he smoothed his hair when the conversation turned toward Lockswood's final hours, the way his eyes flicked to the decanter each time he sought to change the subject. When I asked where he had been on the night of the fall, he delivered his alibi with a practiced softness. He had dined in Summertown, he said, then walked home along Banbury Road. I asked why he mentioned passing under the lantern arch. His expression jolted almost imperceptibly, as though startled by his own carelessness. He murmured something about habit, about it being his usual route. But the explanation lacked conviction. The lantern arch lies nowhere near the natural line between Summertown and St. Gervais. Lewis did not notice the discrepancy, or perhaps he chose to ignore it until we were in private. I admired him for that discretion. Harbury, meanwhile, topped off his own glass with the absent-minded precision of a man attempting normality. Watching him, I recalled a crossword clue from that morning path taken by those who prefer to forget 7 letters. I had not solved it then, but something in Harbury's anxious top-up nudged my mind toward repentance, though the letters did not quite align. The conversation shifted toward Lockswood's work. Harbury praised him in long, winding sentences that failed to conceal a faint edge of rivalry. He spoke of unfinished manuscripts, of debates over translation techniques, of small disputes sharpened by the claustrophobia of shared corridors. Yet the warmth never reached his eyes. When he paused to sip his wine, his hand trembled just enough for me to notice. Rain began tapping at the leaded windows, a quiet percussion that made the room feel smaller. I excused myself and stepped toward the notice board near the door, pretending to examine an upcoming lecture announcement. In truth, I wanted to observe Harbury without the weight of his gaze. He leaned toward Lewis, lowering, his voice in a display of confidence that felt slightly forced. Trust offered too easily is often trust that has something to hide. On the table beside me sat a paper coaster bearing a faint ring of wine, an imperfect circle, smudged at one edge. I found myself tracing it lightly, imagining fingers pressed there in hesitation. It seemed an odd detail to dwell on, but small irregularities often cling to the mind with greater persistence than their more dramatic counterparts. As we left the common room, Harbury offered us a polite farewell. His voice was steady, yet his posture held the rigidity of someone bracing for an unasked question. Outside, the quad glistened under a slick sheen of rain. Lewis observed that Harbury seemed genuine enough. I replied that sincerity, particularly in well-educated men, can be dangerously performative. Walking beneath the cloisters, I revisited the inconsistency in his account. A detour under the lantern arch where no detour was required. A single misplaced detail that might have slipped past a less suspicious mind. And with that, the first faint crack appeared in Harbury's carefully sculpted alabysmal. almost elegant but unmistakably formed. There is a particular stillness that clings to administrative offices, a hush not born of reverence but of arithmetic. Vera Malling's rooms held precisely that kind of quiet, one weighted not by history, as at St. Gervais, but by the relentless necessity of numbers obeying orders. When Lewis and I entered, she greeted us with the restrained courtesy of someone who has long since learned that friendliness invites trouble. Her eyes, sharp, faintly exhausted, flicked toward the stack of ledgers arranged with painful symmetry along her desk. She motioned for us to sit, though she remained standing as if uncertain whether the conversation demanded distance or surrender. I noticed at once that the air smelled of drying ink and window polish, a scent both crisp and oddly bleak. Malling asked in a near monotone whether our questions pertained strictly to funding irregularities or to Adrian Lockswood himself. I told her gently that the two were not quite as separate as one might prefer. Lewis opened with the polite queries, routine audits, discretionary funds, manuscript preservation allotments. Malling responded with the precision of someone who understands that every syllable carries weight. It was only when I asked why the college had paid repeatedly for the conservation of manuscripts that did not exist that a faint crack appeared in her composure. Her fingers tightened against the ledger's spine as though she feared it might slip from her control. She confessed, after a quiet pause, that she had misallocated the funds. Not stolen, she insisted, merely redirected in an attempt to prop up shortfalls the college refused to acknowledge. She said Lockswood had discovered the discrepancy months earlier. I asked whether he had threatened exposure. Malling shook her head, explaining that he had been painfully kind and had urged her to correct the accounts before anyone else noticed. But kindness in institutions such as these is rarely unburdened. It leaves its own ledger of debts. Lewis asked whether she had seen Lockswood on the night he died. Her reply was slow, deliberate. She had heard footsteps beneath the lantern arch sometime after midnight, though she insisted they did not belong to Lockswood. She could tell, she said, by the rhythm, a strange remark, yet spoken with such conviction that I did not question it. Instead, I asked how often she walked the quad at night. She looked at me then with an expression I recognized too well, the weary honesty of someone who has spent long hours pacing worries she cannot name. A loose receipt slipped from one of the ledgers as she turned a page. The corner bore a faint smear of what seemed like graphite, as though someone had tested the sharpness of a pencil there. It reminded me of the chalk-dusted windowsill in Helena's office, a small linking gesture, though I couldn't yet see the significance. I tucked the thought away, knowing these scraps often matter later. Malling resumed her explanation, though her voice had taken on a softer, defeated cadence. She said Lockswood had visited her the week before his fall, urging her again to correct her accounts. He told her there were more important truths to preserve, words that had struck her as melodramatic at the time. She had intended to make the corrections, she murmured, but the college bureaucracy had a way of swallowing the intention whole. As she spoke, I studied her hands. The slight tremor, the restless tapping of her thumb against the ledger's edge. Not guilt, I thought. Fear. The fear of someone who has already been caught once and who suspects more than one trap has been laid at her feet. When we left, the corridor outside her office felt markedly colder, as if Malling's confession had drawn something warm from the air. Lewis suggested that misallocated funds hardly amounted to motive. I agreed, though not entirely. It wasn't motive that interested me, it was the quiet certainty with which she recognized the footsteps beneath the lantern arch. People often reveal more in what they claim to know than in what they confess. And as we stepped back into the quad, the stones glistening with recent rain, I found myself thinking that her voice, steady though strained, had carried a faint echo of truth, an echo that might yet lead us toward the steps that mattered most. The archives of St. Gervais have always possessed a peculiar loneliness, a kind that lingers in the gaps between catalogues and forgotten theses. When Lewis and I descended into that dim chamber, the air carried the faint scent of paper left too long in cold rooms, fragile, stubborn, unwilling to surrender its secrets. The archivist, a soft-spoken man with a hair the color of parchment, guided us to a narrow drawer with the caution of someone unveiling a relic not entirely his to reveal. He murmured that the item had been found during a recent reorganization. An accident, he insisted. I doubted it. Inside the drawer lay the photograph, its edges curled inward as though recoiling from the memory it held. Half of the print had been scorched, burned not in a rush of rage, but with the deliberate patience of someone determined to obliterate a single face. The surviving portion revealed 3 figures I already knew too well: Lockswood, Helena, and Harbury. They stood in a courtyard I recognized from old college excursion pamphlets, all 3 wearing expressions that suggested hope had not yet soured into rivalry. The missing face burned away entirely, hovered like an accusation. Lewis wondered aloud who the 4th person might have been. I told him quietly that the omission was more eloquent than the inclusion. There are ghosts in academic institutions that never make it into footnotes. Someone had taken considerable care to erase this one. As we examined the photograph, the archivist explained that it had been discovered tucked inside a volume of medieval lyric criticism, one of Lockswood's preferred subjects. The book itself bore no inscription, yet a faint outline of ash marred the inside cover. I traced it with my thumb, feeling the brittle texture. Whoever burned the photograph had not intended for it to vanish entirely. They wanted it wounded. I found myself studying Harbury's youthful smile, too broad, too eager for approval. Helena's, by contrast, held a guarded reserve, as though she already understood how easily affection could become leverage. Lockswood looked almost unrecognizable, brighter, less burdened, a man whose future had not yet narrowed into the quiet sorrow of unfinished translations. The absence beside them felt like the missing half of a sentence, one without which the grammar of the whole could not be understood. Lewis stepped away to examine the neighboring files. In his absence, I noticed something else. A thin residue of soot along the photograph's top edge, smudged as though a thumb had pressed there after the burning. A hesitation, perhaps. Guilt or regret. The gesture echoed a detail from earlier in the week, the graphite smear on Malling's receipt, the chalk dust on Helena's windowsill, small marks left by hands that had touched something they wished they hadn't. The archivist mentioned hesitantly that he remembered vague rumors from years past, a scandal involving brilliance misplaced or ambition misdirected. He said no one liked to talk about it, not because it had been sensational, but because it had been quietly destructive. He offered nothing more. Silence in academia is often the highest form of admission. Lewis returned, holding an old directory of student society members. He pointed to an entry listing Lockswood, Helena, Harbury, and a 4th name one faintly penciled in, and later crossed out with an almost violent stroke. I felt the old ache of recognition then, the way institutions tidy their narratives by striking out the inconvenient. A vanished name, a burned face. The past makes itself tidy by erasure. I slipped the photograph into an evidence sleeve, though I could not shake the impression that it had already served its intended purpose. Objects damaged with such precision rarely exist to conceal the truth. More often, they exist to signal it quietly, covertly, with the stubborn persistence of a half-forgotten regret. As we left the archive, Lewis remarked that the missing figure might be the key. I replied that keys require locks, and at the moment we lacked both. What we did possess, and what unsettled me most, was the sense that the past, scorched and sifted though it was, had begun stirring again, like embers refusing to die. Above us, the corridor creaked with the shifting of old beams. The sound lingered too long, like footsteps belonging to someone who no longer wished to be seen. There comes a point in any investigation when silence becomes its own form of resistance, and at St. Gervais that resistance arrived not through hostility, but through courtesy. Everyone was unfailingly polite. Everyone answered questions with care, and yet the more they spoke, the further I felt myself drifting from the center of the truth, as though I were walking a circle drawn so delicately I could not see its boundaries. A case thick with consideration and thin with honesty. Lewis and I began that morning with Harbury. He greeted us with a geniality that felt strangely inflated, like a room overfilled with warm air. He insisted on offering tea, then apologized for the quality of the blend, then expressed deep sorrow for the tragedy. Each phrase felt suspiciously well-fitted, like a suit tailored not for comfort, but for impression. He repeated his Summertown alibi with slightly firmer conviction than before, though I noticed that he avoided mentioning the lantern arch altogether. Avoidance can be louder than admission. Lewis suggested gently that we revisit the matter of the stairwell. Harbury nodded with rehearsed solemnity, but as he spoke, his hands, normally elegant in their movements, began to fidget with the cuff of his sleeve. A small gesture, but enough to remind me of a crossword clue from that morning's paper discreet sign of the guilty 8 letters. I let the clue linger in my thoughts without attempting to solve it. Our next conversation was with Helena Swithin, who looked as though she had spent the night editing an argument she could not bring herself to write down. She spoke of Lockswood with precision, as though describing a character from a text she had studied too thoroughly. She insisted they had not argued. She insisted she had nothing to hide. She insisted too much. Her eyes, however, wandered toward the letter on her desk, the sealed one she refused to open. The pale envelope stood out like a wound she would not let heal. She said quietly that Harbury was ambitious, though she did not believe ambition alone could lead to violence. I asked whether she trusted him. She answered that trust was a luxury in academic circles. I found her candor refreshing, even if it skirted the edges of confession. We then returned to Malling, who had regained her composure but not her ease. Her voice had sharpened, as though she had spent the morning rehearsing her innocence. She repeated that she had seen someone under the lantern arch, not Lockswood, not at that hour. She refused to describe the figure further, claiming the night had distorted her sense of distance. Yet her fingers tapped anxiously on the ledger beside her, forming a rhythm. I recognized the unconscious beat of someone remembering more than she was prepared to share. By late afternoon, the college had taken on the muted glow of places grown weary of scrutiny. Rain tapped softly at the windows. Students drifted through the quad with the solemnity of figures in a half-forgotten dream. I felt the case slipping sideways, its threads pulling in contradictory directions. Each suspect offered pieces of a puzzle that seemed incompatible with the others, as though they were all telling the truth, just not the same truth. Lewis observed that we were encountering a surplus of information rather than a shortage. I told him that misdirection can be crafted as elegantly as a sonnet, and that St. Gervais had no shortage of poets. It was then, as we paused beneath the arch, connecting 2 older buildings, that a detail returned to me not from that day, but from the photograph unearthed in the archive. Lockswood's expression, not fearful, not resentful, expectant, as though he had trusted someone to meet him, someone who had once stood beside him in youth, someone whose face had been burned away. I mentioned it to Lewis only in passing. He frowned, unsure whether the thought belonged to deduction or to melancholy. I wasn't sure myself. The line between those two has always been thin for me. We walked back toward the quad, our footsteps echoing with a faint, off-beat syncopation. And in that quiet rhythm I sensed the shape of a false solution forming itself with seductive clarity. Too clear, too satisfying. The kind of answer a guilty mind might hope I would reach. Red herrings do not shout, they whisper, and St. Gervais was whispering everywhere. I've often thought that Oxford changes character after midnight, as though the city grows tired of its daily obligations and slips back into something older, more honest, less willing to indulge the affectations of daylight. It was under that version of the city, the one unsoftened by polite conversation, that I found myself walking alone toward the lantern arch. Lewis had gone home hours earlier, leaving me with the kind of silence that demands a reckoning. The quad was empty, the grass silvered by moonlight, the stones still damp from an earlier rain. The arch rose ahead of me like a question suspended in mid-air. Even from a distance I could sense the faint hum of memory lingering around it, the sort that clings to places where secrets have waited too long. I stepped beneath it and felt, almost immediately, an unease that seemed to settle between my shoulder blades. Not a subtler thing, like an echo of recognition. I tried to reconstruct Lockswood's final walk. The porter had spoken of footsteps after midnight. Malling had heard the odd rhythm of someone moving beneath the arch, not hurried, not hesitant, simply present. I closed my eyes and listened. At first there was nothing. Then, slowly, a faint pattern began to emerge, the soft scrape of shoe leather against damp stone. Not my own. A second rhythm, slightly delayed, as though belonging to someone walking just far enough behind to avoid being noticed. I turned, instinctively, though of course there was no one. Rain had begun again, the light, insistent kind that feels more like breath than weather. It brought with it a sharp clarity, and with it the memory of the misquoted line from Pearl pinned above Lockswood's desk. I had assumed at first it was a private message to Helena, but the error of the single altered word nagged at me too much. I whispered it aloud, letting the altered phrasing roll over my thoughts. Then I noticed something I had missed before the first letters of each word formed an acrostic. A simple one, almost childish in construction but unmistakable once seen. It spelled a location, a room, a carrel. Harbury's old research carrel in the college library. The thought landed with quiet precision. I turned from the arch without fully meaning to, my steps carrying me toward the north cloister. The library loomed ahead, its windows dark, its doors locked for the night. But old buildings, like old cases, have weaknesses. I found the side entrance unlatched, an oversight or an invitation, I couldn't tell. Inside, the smell of ancient paper greeted me like a reprimand. The library was so silent I could hear the rain tapping faintly against the roof. I moved through the aisles with the caution of someone descending into memory. Harbury's carrel sat near the back, half hidden behind an overgrown bookshelf. A relic of his student days, long unused but not forgotten. I approached it slowly. A small stack of documents lay inside, placed with the false neatness of someone attempting to hide disorder rather than reveal it. I recognized Lockswood's handwriting on the top sheet as a fragment of translation, nothing remarkable until I read the marginal note beside it, not the original. Altered. Ask why. Beneath the page lay the photograph, the same one from the archive, only this copy was unburned. Intact, the missing face is clearly visible. A young man with a sharp expression and an intelligence that seemed almost brittle. A man who had vanished from the college records as though erased. And beneath the photograph, folded with excruciating care, lay a set of typed pages, accusations, cross-referenced evidence, and a draft letter addressed to the college administration. Lockswood had been preparing to expose Harbury, not only for an old academic betrayal, but for a pattern of manipulation that stretched further than I had imagined. A shift in the air made me look up. No footsteps this time, only the weight of the library settled around me like a closed hand. I understood then that Lockswood's meeting under the lantern arch had not been arranged in desperation. It had been arranged in hope that Harbury might finally confront a past he had tried to cauterize, burn, and bury. Hope can be fatal. As I stepped back into the night, the arch loomed ahead of me once more. Its silence felt sharper now, almost accusatory. The footsteps I had imagined earlier returned in memory, soft, delayed, deliberate. The rhythm of someone who knew he was being followed and someone who had every reason to pretend he wasn't. The rain eased, though the air remained heavy. I walked away slowly, carrying with me the unmistakable truth that the case, which had circled itself so elegantly until now, had finally begun to turn inward toward its center, toward Harbury. There are moments in a case when the truth no longer hides, but waits patiently, almost politely, for one to acknowledge it. I felt that stillness as I walked toward Harbury's rooms the following morning, the sky over Oxford a dull wash of pewter. The air held the scent of overnight rain and something else as well, something taut and expectant, as though the city itself anticipated the conversation to come. Harbury answered the door with an expression pitched carefully between surprise and resignation. He invited us in with unnecessary courtesy, gesturing toward two chairs that looked as though they had never been used. Lewis remained standing, and I took a seat. Harbury hovered by the window, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that aimed for scholarly elegance but landed nearer to defensive restraint. I told him where I had been the previous night, the library, his old Carol. His silence was immediate, and in that silence I felt the shape of his fear thin, precise, almost brittle. He asked what I believed I had found, not in anger, but in an exhaustion that suggested the question had lingered for years. I laid the unburned photograph on the table. His shoulders shifted, barely perceptibly, as though some old wound had been pressed. He moved toward the picture, but stopped short of touching it. He murmured that the past had a way of roaming back into one's life, whether invited or not. Lewis asked who the fourth figure had been. Harbury exhaled slowly, defeat edging into the sound. He spoke then of an old colleague, a brilliant young man who had threatened his career not through malice, but through talent. A talent Harbury, in his insecurity, had tried to undermine. Accusations, complaints, a scandal swept under administrative rugs, a half-destroyed reputation, and a half-burned photograph. He said he regretted the act of sabotage, though not convincingly. Regret, when genuine, seldom comes so polished. I watched his hands again with the slightest tremor in his right index finger, the same one I had noticed in the senior common room. A tremor born not of fear, but of memory. I asked about Lockswood, whether he had confronted him that night under the lantern arch. Harbury's composure tightened. He admitted they had arranged to meet. Lockswood had found evidence, letters, drafts, records linking Harbury to that long-buried betrayal. He wanted Harbury to explain himself before he submitted anything to the college. Harbury looked toward the window as he spoke, the pale morning light smudging the outline of his face. He described the meeting as civil at first, Lockswood quiet, almost sorrowful. Harbury was defensive, desperate to frame his actions as misguided youth rather than cruelty. But pride, he said the word with a bitter twist, pride turned their conversation into a struggle neither intended. He reenacted it with careful gestures, a hand raised, a step backward, a misjudged movement on the wet stone near the stairwell. He insisted he had not meant to harm him, only to keep Lockswood from walking away with the documents that might end his career. Lockswood slipped, a small slip, a fatal one. Lewis shifted, uncomfortable with the fragility of the explanation. I remained silent for a few breaths, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards beneath us. Harbury said he panicked. He checked for a pulse. He found none. He left the papers by the stairwell, hoping the rain would take them. Then he walked back beneath the lantern arch, footsteps echoing just slightly out of rhythm, one careful, one unsteady, though already rehearsing innocence. I told him, quietly, that accidents born of pride leave their own unmistakable signatures. He did not argue. Instead, he lowered himself into the nearest chair, his posture collapsing into something closer to truth. When Lewis placed a hand on his shoulder before leading him out, Harbury did not protest. Outside, the sky had begun to brighten with reluctant light. But as I followed them down the corridor, I could not shake the sense that the college itself remained dimmed, as though aware that the neatness of a confession never quite aligns with the untidy shape of a life undone. In the days that followed Harbury's confession, St. Gervais seemed to fold inward, the college withdrawing into the quiet dignity it deploys whenever scandal threatens to disturb its composure. I've seen that instinct before an institutional tightening, like muscles bracing around an old scar. There is little cruelty in it, only an almost ceremonial desire for tidiness. People prefer their tragedies footnoted, not felt. Lewis handled the formalities with his usual steadiness. I remained mostly on the periphery, not out of disinterest, but because something in the case had already begun, retreating inside me, settling into that muted region where certain truths linger without becoming lighter. Pride's slip, as Harbury had called it, repeated itself in my thoughts more than once. Pride seldom arrives alone. It brings with it the ache of things never said, choices never corrected, and regrets that soften nothing. The master summoned me to his study. Sir Quentin's voice was polished, each word lightly burnished so as not to betray relief. He said the college appreciated our swift resolution. He hoped the matter could be handled discreetly. He sighed at intervals, the kind of sighs that sound sympathetic but are actually expressions of fatigue. When he asked whether I believed Lockswood had suffered, I answered with the only truth I could bear, that suffering rarely announces itself, and often arrives long before the moment of its final expression. I left before the conversation could slip into administrative consolations. It was Helena I sought next. Her office door was ajar, the faint scent of chalk and wilted paper curling into the corridor. She sat at her desk, posture rigid, hands resting lightly atop a closed book. When she looked up, her expression held none of the relief one might expect after a culprit had been named. Instead, there was a stillness in her eyes, a kind of internal winter. She asked whether it was truly over. I told her it was as over as such things ever become. She nodded without conviction. I asked whether she had read the letter. She reached toward it still unopened, still resting where it had been days earlier, but stopped short of touching it. She admitted she could not bring herself to break the seal. Words once written could not be unwritten, she said, and she feared they might ask something of her she could no longer give. There was tenderness in that fear, and something like guilt, too. I did not press her. Some silences do not need unraveling, they simply need room. As I stood to leave, she said Lockswood had been kinder than she deserved. She said it quietly, as though the sentence carried a weight she did not wish me to feel. She asked whether I believed Harbury had truly intended to harm him. I replied, that intention is a treacherous compass. People rarely know what they mean to do until the moment after they have done it. She accepted the answer, though sorrow lingered about her like a shadow that had chosen her as its keeper. I walked the corridors without aim, listening to the creak of the old beams overhead. Malling passed me at one point, her expression newly emptied. She offered a stiff nod more apology than greeting, and disappeared down the staircase before I could reply. Even those untouched by guilt carry their own burdens. No ledger can balance them neatly. Later, standing in the quad, I noticed the way the late afternoon light softened the edges of the college buildings. Rain had dried on the stones, leaving faint glimmers where drops had settled. Students crossed the paths in quick, muted lines, their footsteps whispering over the grass. I thought again of the steps I had heard beneath the lantern arch, that slight, echoing hesitation. I understood now that the hesitation had not belonged to fear, but to remorse blooming too late. Lewis found me there, hands in his pockets, gaze lowered. He told me Harbury had been taken into custody without incident. He asked whether I wanted a lift back. I told him I preferred to walk. He accepted this without question. He knows I often need distance from endings. When he had gone, I looked once more toward the lantern arch. The space beneath it held a peculiar quiet, as though aware of its role in the story, yet unwilling to claim it. I felt then an unexpected wave of sorrow, not for Harbury, nor for the man whose life he had undone, but for the quiet failures that accumulate in all of us, the ones no confession can untangle. I stood there a while, listening to Oxford breathe around me, feeling the weight of a scholar's silence, the kind that never shouts but lingers, patient, unanswered, and deeply, irrevocably human. I returned to the lantern arch on a morning that felt neither new nor finished, as though the light itself hesitated before committing to the day. Oxford often does that, holding its breath, waiting to see what one will make of its silence. I walked slowly, not out of fatigue, but because the case had carved a kind of hollow in me, the sort that invites contemplation rather than closure. Some truths arrive cleanly, others leave a residue that clings to the mind long after the facts have settled. The arch rose ahead with its usual indifference. Rain from the night before had gathered in thin, wavering pools along the stone path, each reflecting a distorted sliver of sky. I imagined Lockswood's final steps quiet, deliberate, perhaps tinged with hope he no longer dared name. I imagined Harbury's too, those uneven echoes Malling had recognized without fully admitting it. Two rhythms, out of time with one another, converging briefly beneath this very stretch of stone. I felt their absence like an undertow. Lewis had offered to accompany me, sensing perhaps the weight of my mood. I told him I would rather come alone. Grief, even borrowed grief, has its own strange etiquette. I paused beneath the arch, listening. Nothing. Then, faintly, a memory of sound, so subtle that I could not tell whether it belonged to the past or to the imagination, the soft scrape of a heel, the delicate shift of weight. A second rhythm, delayed, hesitant, the echo of a man who wished he could step backward in time just once, far enough to undo the gesture that had undone him. I walked the length of the arch and let the quiet gather around me. It reminded me of the crossword I had attempted earlier that morning, the clue lingering unresolved. What remains when the truth has spoken? 7 letters. I had stared at it longer than necessary, annoyed that the answer hovered just beyond. Reach. Even now it pulsed at the edge of thought, unwilling to clarify itself. A light breeze stirred the ivy along the college wall, sending a soft rustle through the air. I remembered standing here nights earlier, listening for footsteps that were not mine. I wondered how often one hears echoes of choices already made and mistakes already set in motion. Perhaps that is why I'm drawn to these places, because they offer a quieter version of time, one in which even regret feels measured. I glanced back toward the quad. Helena crossed it slowly, her arms wrapped around a stack of papers as though protecting something fragile. She did not see me. Her expression carried the weight of a sorrow she had chosen not to articulate. I imagined the letter still resting unopened on her desk, its contents suspended in a delicate purgatory between revelation and restraint. Some truths, like certain affections, cannot be faced without altering the shape of one's life. Malling appeared briefly in one of the doorways, speaking in subdued tones to a junior colleague. A shadow clung to her posture, relief interlaced with the thin ache of humiliation. She would survive it, I suspected, though in a quieter, more solitary way than before. Not all consequences are criminal. Students drifted across the quad, murmuring in the half-whisper of youth. Their footsteps blended into a soft rhythm that echoed gently beneath the arch. Yet even among those cadences, I felt the trace of another set, the ones I had heard that night when the case was still unshaped, when every clue felt like a breath held too long. I leaned against the stone and closed my eyes. That crossword clue returned with a sudden clarity, What remains when the truth is spoken? Aftermath. 7 letters. A tidy answer. But standing beneath the weight of the arch, I wondered whether the aftermath was ever truly tidy, or whether it simply marked the point at which people begin pretending the world has steadied itself again. Lewis arrived then, his steps spreading across the stones in gentle interval. He asked, without pressure, whether I wanted to get a pint. I considered the offer, felt the warmth beneath it, and found myself unable to commit to either acceptance or refusal. Instead, I murmured that I would follow shortly. He nodded, understanding more than I had said. When he walked away, the space beneath the arch felt strangely full of echoes, of choices, of the quiet persistence of regret. I stood there a while longer, letting the morning settle into its ordinary rhythm. Eventually I turned to leave, though I could still feel the faint impression of footsteps behind me, steady, solemn, and impossibly familiar. Some echoes fade, others stay, and a few, especially the ones born of pride, sorrow, and human frailty, walk beside us long after the investigation ends.